Well, that doesn't sound good. Hey, what's going on, guys? The transmission has failed in my 2005 Scion TC with 286,000 original miles. So I'm kind of at a crossroads here. If you don't know, transmission repair is very expensive. It can cost upwards of $2,500 or more, depending on the vehicle. And for a car this model and age, is just not feasible. But the car is too nice, too fun to drive for me to let it go to the junkyard. So my only option right now is to fix it myself. The problem is I have never done a major repair like this, but I'm confident I can do it. Enough research, I will figure it out. So I'm going to take you on this journey and show you how I replaced the transmission by myself in an automatic transmission in my 2005 Scion TC. I'm not comfortable with filming while I work, especially when it's something that I've never done before. But this is just a tutorial on what you can expect if you're going to tackle this project yourself. And I do believe that you can do it. I did it by myself, and I would rate it 6 out of 10 on a difficulty scale. It wasn't that difficult at all on this particular vehicle. So let's get into it. You're going to need your basic tools like ratchet, screwdriver, wrench sets, extensions. You're going to need at least 4 jack stands, maybe. Hydraulic jack is great for this project. An impact wrench is really handy. You can get those pretty cheap if you have air compressor. Fortunately, I do have a shop and I have access to all of these tools, so it makes it a lot easier. A creeper is nice to have. And for special tools for this job, I had to go to Harbor Freight and purchase an engine support bar and a transmission jack. To get started, I jacked the car up maybe a foot off the ground and put it on jack stands. Then I removed the hood, the front bumper cover, and the front wheels. Starting on the top, I removed the battery carrier, and I started unplugging some of the wires and the hoses, removed the breather, and all of that stuff. It's daunting when you first start removing things, but rest assured when it's time to go back, everything will fall into place. All of the plugs are specific and they will fall into place into their own little harnesses. So, and as well as the hoses. So don't worry about how things are going to go back. Just start ripping stuff off. This is the fun part. But be mindful that the little plastic tabs, after so many heat cycles on the engine, they do break easily. So the plastic tabs on the wire harnesses, be very careful not to break those off. When you get to the transmission control cable that the shifter's connected to, don't mess with the clip. Just take the 2 bolts out of that mount and you can let that whole cable just rest to the side. Then you want to remove the oil filler tube. It's just 1 bolt and you have to jiggle it out, but it only gets in your way, so you don't need it. Next, you're going to remove the starter. It's just 2 14mm bolts holding it on. Now you're going to disconnect the 2 cooler lines. I used an adjustable wrench and removed those. With everything disconnected from the top side, it's time to remove the axles. Both axles must come out. And for sake of time, just refer to a different video for axle removal for Scion TC. One tip I will give you is the hardest bolt to get to on this entire project is the top bolt on the passenger side axle. It's a mount. It's really difficult to get to. I fought with it for a while, and then finally I decided to just put my impact wrench, feed my impact wrench back there. Underneath the back of the engine, you can get an impact wrench back there, and you can just wind that bolt right off. Now with the axles out and everything disconnected from the transmission, the only thing holding the transmission is the rear mount, the driver's side mount, and the front mount. It was time to support the engine. So I just used the 2 bolts that came out of the starter. I used those inside for the engine head to support on the chains to support the engine. Next, I removed the long bolt on the rear transmission mount, and I started removing the bolts on the bottom sub assembly. There's only one little cross brace under this car that makes it really easy to get to. There's only one caveat. One of the rear holes on the sub-assembly has a stud going through it. That stud is connected to the rear transmission mount, so you can't remove it. It's really difficult to remove, so you don't have to. Just loosen the rear transmission mount bolts and let that sub-assembly hang down out of the way. This will allow you to get to the torque converter bolts as well as the bell housing bolts on the back of the engine. After this, I was able to remove the 6 torque converter bolts. I believe they're either 12 millimeter or 10 millimeter. You have to turn the crankshaft with a 3/4 wrench and get to those bolts. And I removed the bell housing bolts from the transmission while I was down there as well. Now this transmission jack, it worked okay. It wasn't perfect, but for $129, you can't expect too much. It was very wobbly, but I was able to manage the strap that holds it in place. Fortunately, it held up. I was afraid it was going to just snap and just drop the transmission and everything go haywire. But the transmission jack, it did work for this job. It got the job done. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. With the transmission supported, it was time to remove the transmission mounts from the driver's side. I think it was a lot of 14 millimeter bolts that you remove with the socket and the wrench. And I removed the front bolt. Well, the front bolt actually came down with the sub-assembly. So the only thing that was holding this transmission up at this point was the jack and the engine mount. So this thing was ready to come out. Once I got all of the bell housing bolts out, I just took a chisel and between the engine and transmission, tapped it a couple times and the transmission dislodged. And all I had to do is ratchet it down and the transmission was able to kind of maneuver it out, and it was out. It was a very easy process. In my opinion, this was not a hard job at all. I did not have a transmission sourced yet. I wanted to get this one out first, make sure this job, I was confident that I could do this job before I invest in more money into this project. So for my transmission replacement, I had 3 options. I could try to rebuild the transmission myself, which was mind-boggling. There are so many parts inside this transmission that I got dizzy just looking at. Transmission repair rebuilders, I'm just gonna let them have it, let them have that profession. So I looked into remanufactured transmissions, and those were not cheap. I think the lowest price I saw was about $2,500. Really, it's closer to $3,000 before the core credit, so that was not feasible either. So the next option, the last option, was a junkyard transmission. A lot of people will cringe when you think of junkyard transmissions, but if we buy used cars, I don't see the difference in buying a junkyard transmission. I trust it if I do my due diligence. And so I turned to eBay. I was looking at eBay cars, and my dad used to always tell me that if you're going to buy an engine or transmission out of a car, make sure it's wrecked, because you at least know that it was moving. If the body is perfect, then the car, the engine or transmission is probably trash. So I found a seller online. I did not know how I was going to get this transmission, because it's not light at all. It's pretty heavy. I can lift it. I try to be careful with lifting heavy things. I don't want to, I damaged my back when I was younger. So I can lift with my legs, but maybe a few inches off the ground just to keep it safe. So I did not know how I was going to get this or anything. So fortunately, I reached out to this seller, Phoenix Parts MW on eBay. And I told them that I needed this transmission delivered to a residential address. And they were like, no problem, we'll take care of it, no additional charge. So I found a 2007 Scion TC that looked to be in really good condition, all original. Looks like the owner took very good care of it. 122,000 miles, which for me is barely broken in. I can drive cars well into the 200,000s as long as you take care of them. They will take care of you. So I placed the order. Phoenix contacted me the very same day to confirm my shipping address, and they also confirmed that my VIN number on my car to make sure everything was a match. A couple of days later, I received a call from R&L Carriers to schedule a delivery. While I was waiting on the transmission to come, I went ahead and swapped out some parts that were otherwise hard to get to with the transmission installed, like the rear main seal on the engine, and as well as that rear transmission mount. I also flushed the transmission cooler lines because that's a very important step. You don't want that old oil and grit and metal going into your new transmission. I also changed out the PCV valve and gave the engine a good oil change. R&L Carriers, they delivered the transmission on time. It was very early in the morning. It was a bright, sunny day, so it was a very good day to work on a car. I was able to get the transmission lifted enough just to get onto the dolly, my dolly, and so it was very easy to get it from the pallet onto my dolly, and I was able to wheel it back to my shop. So everything was going as planned. One of my biggest hesitations when I was searching for an online transmission was that the donor car that was represented online was that the actual transmission that I was going to get. And one thing that I like about Phoenix parts is that they included a tag with the donor car information. So, whether it's legit or not, I don't know, but that really gave me a little reassurance, and I think that's a cool thing that they did. Before I installed the transmission, I changed out the transmission filter, and I also changed out the torque converter seal. I had to go buy a little seal puller from Harbor Freight. It was about $8, and the seal itself was about $10. I took the one out of the old transmission and took it up to AutoZone just to make sure it matched the new seal. I was able to then slide the transmission from the dolly onto the transmission jack, so everything kind of stayed low. I never lifted the transmissions no more than a few inches off the ground. So this is really a one-man project, and I was able to kind of use my brain and figure out how to do this by myself. As I stated before, this transmission jack is far from perfect, but what can you expect? For $129, it got the job done, but it was very, very wobbly, had a lot of movement going on, but I was able to get it to work. The straps did hold up, fortunately, and I used a half-inch socket and just ratchet it up slowly. It gets kind of hard because the transmission is so heavy, and it doesn't feel like it's going up, but it is going up slowly. So I was able to kind of maneuver it in and jack it up slowly until it got close to aligning with the engine. So this is the point I assume would be the hardest part of this entire project: getting the engine to line up perfectly and accept the transmission, because there are some dials, there are a couple dials. The engine has its own tilt, the transmission has its own tilt, so I'm thinking that this is going to be a nightmare part. So I did cut the camera off here because I didn't know if I was going to be all day, if I was going to have to cut it off for today and just come back tomorrow and I did not know how far this thing was going to push me. I will say that it only took me about 15 minutes to figure it out, how to get this transmission to mate up with the engine. I fought with it for a while. It got to a point where I couldn't turn the transmission anymore, and the engine, it just wasn't lining up. So I thought about just putting a drill bit through one of the holes, line a drill bit on one of the holes, and I kicked the transmission with my foot just a little bit, just moved it around, shook it, and the thing made it up, and I was just so elated. I noted the time at 1:04. I cut the camera off. At 1:19, I had the engine mated up with the transmission with the bolt in it. So 15 minutes and this transmission was in, and it was all downhill from here. So once I got a few bolts in the transmission, the bell housing, I started putting things back together. I started with the torque converter bolts underneath, those little 6 bolts. They're very short, and the torque converter is kind of pushed closer in the transmission, so they barely reach. I was nervous that this was going to be a problem, but I was able to get one of the threads into the torque converter, get it started, and it pulled the torque converter close to the flex plate, so I was able to get those bolts in there. So from here, everything else was just kind of reversing what I did. It was a slow process, just putting all the bolts back in, moving the engine around, getting the mounts to line up, the rear transmission mount, that bolt that goes into the rear transmission mount. That can give you a little problem, but you can kind of jiggle it around, and I was able to get an impact wrench back there and tighten up that bolt. I got the passenger or the driver's side mounts back connected, bolted back in, and the front belt bolted back in, and then the engine and some transmission was supporting itself at that point. I got the axles in, all the connectors and hoses back connected. When I first tried it out, I wasn't getting all the gears. The drive was not lighting up, and I started the car and it made a grinding noise, and I was like, oh my god, did I just mess something up? So you have to be really careful here at this point. Make sure your shifter cable is adjusted appropriately, or you won't be getting all your gears. But I found like if everything lights up and the gear shift feels smoothly, you're getting through your park all the way to your low without any issues, then you should be okay. All right, the moment of truth. I got the car down in the shed and it went forward, it went reverse, so I guess that's a good thing. It was time to take this thing out for a test drive. So at this point, I am grinning from ear to ear. This thing, it's shifting out so smoothly, it's so quiet, and yeah, I succeeded. I didn't know if I could do this, but hey, it's done, and I guarantee you can do it too if you like to. So let me give you some of the stats. I logged all the time. For the time, it took me about 13 and a half hours, but a lot of that was just figuring things out and making store runs and back and forth to the auto place. But I can probably do this job again if I had to in about 8 hours. I'm thinking 8 hours, maybe less. As far as how much it costs with the transmission and the tools like the transmission jack and the engine support, and the transmission filter and the seals and the fluid, it came out to be just under $1,000, about $989. So that's not bad at all. If the average American is paying about $600 a month for a car note, then this thing is going to pay itself off in less than 2 months, and I'm confident it will last. But yeah, back to the car. It drives wonderful. 286,000 miles. It's not a hot rod, it's not a sports car by any means, but it's a very good, reliable point A to point B a source of transportation, and I plan to keep it as long as I can. I actually have thought about doing an engine swap on it, putting another engine in it, so I'll definitely do that if this engine does not last. I'm definitely open to that. But anyway, I hope this video helps anyone who wants to tackle this project. Again, this is for the Scion TC. I will rate this project about a 6 or 7 out of 10. It wasn't very hard at all. There are very few bolts that are very hard to get to. It's just a tedious process of taking things off and putting them back how you got them. But yeah, I believe you can do this project. So anyway, I hope y'all enjoy.